Supergirl is a character that I've found myself drawn to more and more as time goes on. I think my obsession with the character started when I first watched Superman Batman Apocalypse, which is one of my favorite entries in the DC animated original movie lineup, and features Kara Zor-El, aka Supergirl, as the main protagonist with an interesting twist. While most protagonists lead their story by making decisions, the catch with Kara's character is that she completely lacks autonomy, and her journey is about her eventually, through many hardships, finally asserting herself as an individual by standing up to Darkseid of her own volition. It was an incredibly powerful arc to me, and definitely drew me into the character. Then, I watched Friendly Space Ninja's video on the CW Supergirl, because I didn't have the patience to watch the show myself, and I was fascinated by his description of the New 52 iteration of the character, in the run titled Last Daughter of Krypton, which depicts Kara as a character driven primarily by grief and anger at her situation. In the series, at least through to issue 30, which is as far as I've gotten so far, Kara is racked by one life-altering event after another, each time being promised hope and salvation, only to end up hurt, confused, and even angrier than before due to betrayal and hardship. Some might consider this version of the character petulant, and I can agree to a certain extent, but I thought that this was entirely justifiable given her canonical age of 16 at the beginning of the run, and that what she goes through, I thought anyway, warranted a lot of the melodrama that it brought. However, that run suffered in my opinion simply due to the interconnected nature of comic books and how those stories are structured. Namely, she was written significantly lighter, and some might say completely out of character, during her crossovers with the other members of the Super family, and so far I'm not enjoying her run as a Red Lantern that much either, due to how little knowledge I have of the various lanterns in general. This leads me to today, where I just finished what I can definitively say is one of my top 3 favorite comic books of all time, which is Supergirl, Woman of Tomorrow, written by Tom King, illustrated and colored by Bilquis Evely, with help on covers by Matt Lopes. Lopez? Lopes. Whatever. Depending on how it ruminates, it may even come out on top over All-Star Superman and The Dark Knight Returns. Original picks, I know. Supergirl Woman of Tomorrow is an unusual comic series, at least from what I understand with my limited frame of reference. The entire story is a big homage to True Grit, a John Wayne classic western, which was later remade with Jeff Bridges. True Grit is definitely one of the better westerns of the time, with several absolutely iconic scenes, best of all being the "fill your hands you son of a bitch" standoff at the end. As a quick recap, True Grit tells the story of Maddie Ross, whose father was recently murdered by his own farmhand, Tom Chaney. As the authorities flounder, she takes it upon herself to track down Chaney and bring him to justice. She enlists the help of the local drunk Marshal Rooster Cogburn, and they are eventually joined by the straight-laced Texas Ranger LaBouffe. Along the way, they find that Chaney has joined up with Ned Pepper and his gang, and though LaBouffe and Cogburn try to ditch Maddie at every available opportunity, the trio do grow closer through their manhunt. Cogburn, though he is misanthropic, a drunk, and far from the typical heroic ideal, rises to the occasion and stages a one-man war on Pepper and his gang. And eventually, though LaBouffe dies and Maddie is bitten by a venomous snake, Chaney is killed and Cogburn and Maddie return to civilization, with Maddie giving Cogburn his bounty and promising to give him a proper burial site alongside her family when his time finally comes, which he accepts. It's a pretty good story, though modern audiences will have to adjust to the social norms of the time. Maddie is an unusually pragmatic and assertive young woman, which was seen as highly improper during the time that the movie takes place, and Cogburn even gives her a spanking for being so stubborn and following him on the manhunt. However, it isn't nearly to the point of one of John Wayne's other westerns, McClintock, whose climax involves a man ominously chasing a fleeing woman to beat her for insubordination while the town cheers him on because she was a bit of a whiny bitch. It was a different time, and back then, that was a comedy. In any case, now that you know the story of True Grit, you basically know the story of Supergirl Woman of Tomorrow, in a sense. It runs with the basic premise of a manhunt with an older, misanthropic person being hired by a young girl to pursue her father's killer. However, it's given a comic book / sci-fi twist, in that it's a space odyssey with many twists and turns. Ruth is a farmer's daughter, and is the only one of her siblings to leave her home after he's murdered by King's agents named Krem, with only the sword used to commit the act as payment for anyone who would help. By happenstance, she runs into Supergirl at the bar and asks for her assistance, and after Krem shoots and mortally wounds Krypto the Superdog, Kara agrees to help with the manhunt. From there, the two pursue Krem across the whole of space, stopping or avenging atrocities, and aiding the common folk in equal measure along the way. Eventually, they capture Krem and try to bring him into the proper authorities, only to be pursued by his massive gang of brigands, whom Kara faces alone. It's only thanks to the heroic sacrifice of Comet the Superhorse, just go with it, that she's able to come out victorious, and though she thinks she failed to impart the lesson that violence begets violence and killing is never the answer, Supergirl resolves to do the deed herself and spare Ruth from staining her hands. However, Ruth insists that she did learn the lesson. From the multitude of kind, selfless acts Supergirl displayed in her presence, coupled with knowing the horrifically tragic origin of who is now her friend, Ruth was inspired to be the better person, and found that she not only wouldn't cut Krem down, but couldn't. Flashing forward to an elderly Ruth recounting her book based on the events we've witnessed, Kara visits her with news that Krem has served his sentence in the Phantom Zone and is repentant. Though, when released and begging for forgiveness, Ruth bashes him over the head with her cane, and Supergirl doesn't help him, while the fictitious ending to the book that Supergirl went through with killing Krem is recounted as he drops his arm, presumably unconscious. Now, unlike True Grit, which is a straightforward tale of revenge in the Old West, Supergirl Woman of Tomorrow opts to try and spread a message which is so synonymous with the character of Supergirl, that of restraint and mercy. It's a moral that's really synonymous with the superfamily in general. These characters have godlike power and must always know their own strength, lest they rip planets apart from their might. In most Superman stories, and indeed most Supergirl stories, this is never an issue for them, or at the very least, it's an issue for a specific storyline, or especially early in their run, and then dropped in favor of some other theme, which is fine. However, what I appreciate so much about this iteration of Kara is that she does struggle with it in a way that's both inspiring and heart-wrenching at the same time, and her tragedy feeds into why Ruth is able to internalize the lesson Kara had hoped to impart, even when she thought she'd failed to do so. This Kara Zor-El isn't a vengeful god, nor is she particularly angry at any point that isn't justified. In many ways, she is the heroic ideal of the superfamily, always upholding truth, justice, and the American way. However, there is a sadness to her that stays mysterious throughout much of the comic, and only becomes clear when it recontextualizes her experiences regarding Krypton. There are moments scattered throughout the story of Kara staring off into the horizon, of her trying her best to give comforting advice, of her becoming visibly frustrated when her attempts to help people result in her being buffeted away, and it all stems from this pain in her soul, and how what she stands for and what she believes are, in some ways, at odds with each other. In short, Kara is a tragic character, and that tragedy has never been portrayed better than in this series. I'm going to read through the entirety of this book's recollection of the death of Krypton, and hope that it conveys half as well without the visuals. And it's fairly long, so sorry. She wasn't the baby who went off in the rocket. She was the schoolgirl who knew Krypton as home, family, and refuge. She lived in her world, and she saw it die. As she started telling her story, I asked why. Why me? Why now? She said she'd barely survived the last attempt to get Krem, and she had doubts she'd survive this next one. She just figured before she passed, someone ought to know. The quakes came hard and swift as she walked home from school. She could hardly keep upright. The streets cracked, and she watched dozens of her neighbors consumed by waves of steel and crystal, screaming for help as they were dragged into the fiery depths of Krypton. She kept walking. A man called out to her. She turned, seeing someone familiar, the manager of a local solar fuel store. A chunk of rock had cleaved through his belly, and he was clutching on to his guts, trying to stuff them back in place. He told her he couldn't hold on, it was all slipping through his fingers, and he begged for her help. Could she just put her hand there? That's all, just a little help. He fell at her feet, and there was blood on her boots. She kept walking. She passed a rocket stroller tipped over, and she did not hear any cries from the babe who must have been inside. Maybe its mother had taken it to someplace good and safe, or maybe its pain was mercifully over, and its eyes shut forever. Or maybe it was keeping still because the clatter of ruin had grown too loud, and that was its instinct in that moment. Supergirl never found out. She kept walking. Krypton had held thousands of generations safe in its bosom. Epics were written, idols were worshipped, wars were waged, children were born, dead were mourned, heroes were celebrated, stars were discovered, histories were researched, lands were conquered, families were raised. The edifices of ambition were built and destroyed, and built again and destroyed again, and built again and destroyed again. There was love and jealousy and hope and tears and agony and laughter. There was the view out her window in her room in her apartment. An ancient bobuck tree with red and blue leaves that fell in the fall and returned in the spring. She watched the wind blow through them, watched them dance each morning. Afterward, she often thought of waking on a chilled Krypton morning, looking out her frosted window as day broke from night, and the roasted, sweet smoke of newly carved hogue meat rose up to her along with her mother's impatient call, chiding her for again sleeping past first prayer. She had visited so many planets, but she never saw anything quite like that view again. Red and blue leaves, and the wind blowing through them. Krypton did not die in a day. The gods were not that kind. The minute chunk of the planet that held Argo City was spit out in the initial explosion. Most of the city's denizens died in the breakage, but some endured. Zor-El, a famed scientist of the city, who happened to be Supergirl's father, was able to bubble enough atmosphere for those lucky folks left on the asteroid to survive, for a while. Her mother never did wake. Eventually, Zor-El turned off the machines that were pumping her heart. As he did, Supergirl stayed by her bed and told her about the red and blue leaves that used to dance outside her window. The diagnosis was radiation poisoning. Zor-El discovered the cause. Starlight from approaching yellow suns had changed the chemical composition of the rocks carrying them. The sod beneath their feet was poisoning them. Zor-El's solution was to mass-produce lead shields and spread them over every nook and cranny of exposed land, a makeshift wall between them and the contagion. People were dying and the task was massive. Every hand was required. By the end of the first hour, or how they defined the hours then, clinging to the twists of a now lost world, her wrists ached and blood from broken blisters dripped down her arm. She switched hands and kept going. By the end of the first 40 hours of uninterrupted work, sleep came hard for her and she could not keep her eyes open. She slammed her hammer into her thigh, breaking the skin there. The snap of pain woke her enough, and she gathered some more lead. By the end of the first 80 hours, the massive helpers had conceded to exhaustion and acknowledged the impossibility of the task. Thousands of Kryptonians, the last of their planet, lay fallow throughout the rock, mourning their inevitable coming death. So, she worked alone. The wall of lead was completed in 3 weeks. Of the 18,000 citizens still alive in Argo City after the destruction of Krypton, about 13,000 eventually died of kryptonite poisoning. When she was done hammering all the lead plates, Supergirl turned her attention to building crypts, including her mother's. A year went by, and she survived the best she could, keeping mostly to herself, tired of befriending the dying. They could not steer the rock, and so they floated hither and thither through the depths of space, relying on prayer and fate. She remembered the day the storm came. She heard it before she saw it, said it was actually fairly pleasant at first. There was no rain in space, and the plinking of the rocks hitting the lead reminded her of days stuck at home with nothing to do but read and look out that window, the wet on the red and blue leaves. Out her window that day, she saw the asteroids fall, the hailstones puncturing their improvised shield. She knew the radiation had come back, that those left would soon be leaving, and that was the end of her ever relying on prayer and fate. She found her father in his lab weeping. As with many men of his generation, he was a man who frowned upon emotional expression. She had never seen him with so much as a tear in his eye before, even as they stood over her mother's body. She asked him, "Is there hope?" And he said, "There is always hope. For you." They cannot rebuild the shield. They did not have the resources. The radiation would come, and over the next month, everyone in Argo City who had survived the first wave would die in the second. However, during that time, before the cancer claimed him, Zor-El thought he could repurpose what was left of the lead and build a rocket. His frivolous brother had shared his plans for such a ship, and he had listened enough to those fantasies to understand the basics. It wouldn't be much of a vessel, but it'd be capable of finding a destination millions of light years from that cursed rock. Based on his calculations, given the constraints of weight, food, and water, he thought the rocket could carry a single passenger. "It will carry you," he said. "We will die. You will live." "Why me?" she asked. "You are my little girl, and I will save you," he said. "No. What I have seen, how can I still be a little girl?" she asked. "Tomorrow will come soon enough," he said. "And I will pass, and this place will pass, and stars will fall, and suns will rise. And you will be a woman looking back on the many decades of your life, the terrors and the triumphs, and perhaps you will think of your father then. And perhaps you will remember that whatever has happened, whatever pain you have ever endured, you are still my little girl." For the next month, Zor-El pieced together the rocket, and Supergirl cared for the sick, trying to bring them comfort as the poison claimed their bodies. It was her third time watching the light of life fade around her. Her third time hearing her neighbors gasp for their last breaths. Her third time collecting bodies for mass burial. Her third time watching her world die. She was 14. Honestly, everything about that story is perfect. The hope fading into hopelessness, the simple yet elegant descriptions of nature juxtaposed against the horror of what Kara is running from by recollecting it, and of course, the final stinger at the end. Kara Zor-El is the most compelling member of the Super family for me, specifically because of her unique connection to Krypton, and that she's the only one that remembers it. In other media, Krypton's destruction is portrayed as a singular event that Kara barely escapes from, and, upon landing on Earth, causes her grief and rage, as she's never given time to truly process her loss without a whole bunch of supervillains getting in the way of that. Here, we witness Kara coming to terms with it throughout her retelling through the visuals, as we learn that she survived and yet was subjected to a fate worse than death by having to witness Krypton's death day by day, quickly entropying into nothingness. And yet she still carries on. This Kara Zor-El is a profoundly depressed character, and when you know the full context behind why, when you understand how slow and soul-draining the death of Krypton was in her mind, having taken place over more than a year of her life, it makes every one of her actions all the more understandable. It makes sense why she would want to wallow away her 21st birthday in a random bar on a random planet where she didn't even have any powers. It makes sense why she'd hate Krem and his brigands for causing the same kind of sorrow to the people that survived them as she went through, but she's also inspiring. Even aside from the many overtly kind things she does, such as helping that alien dig all of the graves and even point out his daughter, who he feared he would never find, to teaching Ruth how to wash her hands for no other reason than she thought it was a good habit to get into. No, the one that stands out to me is when she lies to Ruth. When Ruth says that she must hate the brigands for how they gleefully slaughter whole people, resulting in the same kind of genocide Krypton experienced, Kara simply says, "I'm Supergirl. I don't hate anyone." She tried so desperately to convince Ruth that this was the case, and it could be argued that she tries, and often fails, to convince herself of that as well, by how she tries to help unscrupulous people and lashes out when she gets frustrated, albeit in minor ways like blowing down a dick's house of cards. In fact, the reason that she thought she failed to spread the messages of hope, kindness, and mercy is because she was never able to fully convince herself of it. Just as Ruth never stopped thinking about killing Krem, Kara never stopped dreaming of Krypton. Both, to Kara's mind, were still trapped by the shadows of their past. That's why she opts to carry on as the only one of them that remains stained by bloodshed and guilt. Better her, who can't do anything about her tragedy, than Ruth, who still has a life and loving family to get back to, and who would be irreparably damaged if she were to go through with the murder. And while it's unclear how much of that final page was real, and what was just a part of Ruth's story, I truly believe that Kara repeated her phrase, "It's too big, we're too small." I think it's best left to interpretation whether Kara is saying it to mean that she was finally willing to admit and confront her own grief after Ruth has displayed the ability to overcome hers, or if it's simply repetition to highlight how far they've come, set in relief to Ruth being the bigger person. Either way, I think it works, and is incredibly powerful. Supergirl is my favorite DC superhero. If that wasn't already true before, it certainly is now, and Supergirl Woman of Tomorrow is a big reason as to why that is. I've never seen a more nuanced, engrossing take on the character, and the story structure, different but equally cold and brutal scenarios they find themselves in, were gripping the whole way through. As well, though I didn't mention it, the art and colors are top notch, and as far as I'm concerned, the book is worth reading even if only to look at the pretty colors. Thank you all for watching. Like, comment, and subscribe. And for the love of Krypton, go buy this comic. Until the end, my friends.